Ted, thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
I'm doing terrific. How about you, Trey?
I'm great, and thank you so much for the time. Look, I know that people have their opinions on politics, but I value your input on things because you care a lot about sports. Ted, let's start here because you were early on the whole NIL thing and trying to help efforts federally with what the NCAA and these universities have been doing. A couple months ago, you hosted a very valuable roundtable with Nick Saban, Greg Byrne, Jim Phillips, the ACC Commission, the Cavender twins, just to really try and figure out what is most important, what the federal government should be doing to help this whole process along. So what do you think the federal government's role is in ensuring that NIL is set up in a way that works best for the student athletes, universities, and the fans who have loved college sports for so long?
Well, the federal government needs to act, and we need to act promptly. College athletics is incredibly important. It unifies us. It brings us together. It has provided an avenue for thousands upon thousands of young men and young women to get an excellent education. It teaches teamwork and discipline. And it unifies communities. It ties alums and fans to their schools. College athletics is a magical institution, and I think it is in real jeopardy right now. The current state of affairs is the Wild West. When you combine unlimited NIL rights with an unlimited transfer portal, we are entering an arena where every player goes to the highest bidder, and the loyalties of players to teams and the ethos of college sports is at real jeopardy. We're also at risk of seeing a handful of giant mega schools with all the money creating super teams and the rest of schools unable to compete, which I think would be terrible. To have college athletics succeed, you have to have some modicum of parity. Part of what's beautiful about college athletics is on any given day, even a small school can win. And that's something that I think is in real jeopardy right now. I believe Congress needs to act. I think there should be a national standard. There have been multiple bills introduced in Congress. I introduced legislation that was the product of spending many months listening to stakeholders, listening to universities, listening to conferences, listening to the NCAA, listening to players, and trying to really solicit best practices. And the legislation I've introduced, number one, protects NIL rights for college athletes. I think that is fair, and I think it's right that if you've worked incredibly hard, if you've developed remarkable skills, you ought to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor. And so I think it is a much more fair system that college athletes who have extraordinary talent should be able to reap the rewards from that. But at the same time, there needs to be a set of rules and a set of standards across the board. And my legislation empowers the NCAA to set those rules. There are different bills that have been filed that would create a governmental agency or a quasi-governmental agency to set those rules. I think that's a mistake. I think the last thing anyone should want is elected politicians deciding what constitutes pass interference. That would be a nightmare. The NCAA has its faults, to be sure, but I think it is far better to have a governance system where the member institutions have a say and it is drawn from the stakeholders. And so my hope is that the recent settlement, the House settlement for the NCAA, will provide an impetus for Congress to step in and act. In order for Congress to act, there's got to be bipartisan agreement. We're not there yet, but I'm hopeful we'll get there.
The NCAA and schools are practically begging the federal government to help out in keeping college athletes from being considered employees of the athletics department or university. Yep. Do you agree with that sentiment, that that's ultimately what should happen here as well? And if so, why?
So I do, and the legislation I've drafted has a couple of very important provisions. One, it explicitly states that college athletes are not employees. Two, it provides a safe harbor so that colleges and the NCAA, in setting up and establishing the rules and following the rules, won't get sued. Because right now we're saying the rules made by litigation, that whatever the schools do, whatever the conferences do, they get sued, and there's one class action lawsuit after another. That's not good for college athletics. And when it comes to student athletes, I don't think they should be treated as employees. Employees are very, very different from student athletes. Employees typically can be fired at will. I don't think we would want college athletes who have scholarships being fired because they dropped one too many passes or they had too many turnovers bringing the ball down the court. Employees, their compensation is taxable. Right now, scholarships paid to athletes are not taxable. One of the consequences of being an employee, that could change. Beyond that, employees are governed by all sorts of labor rules, OSHA rules. I got to say, when I was doing high school sports, the 2 days that I ran in the Houston blazing August sun, I'm pretty sure would run afoul of OSHA. But nobody should want to see all of those regulations descending on college sports. And so my hope is that we will see bipartisan agreement protecting what is special and unique about student athletes.
So I hear what you're saying about the taxable income, and we've heard Greg Sankey of the SEC talk about this as well. I guess the thing that I'm curious about with that is if you are earning income, you are either considered an independent contractor or an employee. And as an independent contractor, doesn't it potentially get a little bit more complicated for them with regards to taxation and the need to keep track of a whole lot more versus if you were considered an employee and the employer is taking care of at least part of that for you?
Well, it could, and listen, part of how this system grows out will take some time to develop, but I'll point out that students that are receiving NIL revenue, that they're obligated on the NIL revenue to pay taxes already. That's the existing tax law. And so there's a difference between revenue they're getting for their name, image, and likeness versus their scholarship versus the benefits that they're getting being a student athlete. And I'll tell you, one of the most concerning consequences if student athletes were treated as employees is our colleges and universities are telling us the consequence of that would be that many current athletic programs would be eliminated. You know, it's easy to think of this issue in the context of football or basketball in the power conferences. But it's worth remembering that there are thousands and thousands of student athletes playing in Division II schools, playing in Division III schools, playing in non-revenue sports. There are all sorts of sports that provide tremendous benefits to students, but are not going to generate millions of dollars in revenue the way Longhorn football does. And if college athletes are treated as employees, the universities have told us the consequence of that will be many of those non-revenue programs will be eliminated. That's a terrible outcome. That means thousands of young people who are right now able to get a college education would lose that path to a college education. And it's worth remembering, fewer than 1% of college athletes are going to end up playing pro ball. And so for the vast majority of them, the benefit is not being on the cover of Sports Illustrated or making millions of dollars in the NBA or the NFL, but rather the benefit is being able to go to school, being able to afford to go to school, getting an education that you can build a career, that you can provide for your family. And, you know, I think it speaks volumes that the historically black colleges and universities have explicitly come out and said, please do not treat student athletes as employees because it will force us to eliminate many of these programs that make such an important impact for the young men and women coming to our schools.
Well, that's why it's hard not to wonder if the ultimate solution here doesn't include separating football, especially at the Power 5 or now Power 4 level, from the rest of the athletics departments to allow some semblance of amateur status for those sports that aren't making money. Yeah, you're going to have to rework the finances a little bit, but ultimately it is football and to a lesser degree basketball that are helping to prop up a lot of these other sports, I guess, to your point.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think all of that is an area for natural compromise in the legislative process. Right now, we have a system where different states are enacting NIL legislation, and it's the Wild West because every state has an incentive to maximize the chances of the best athletes coming to their state, and it's a race to the bottom. And so it leads to things like in Texas, the state legislature's passed NIL legislation, but it's done something I've never seen in any other state legislation, which is the bill explicitly calls on Congress to act. And it says, we can't govern this state by state. There has to be a uniform standard for the whole country. And my hope is, look, I think in the Senate, there is a widespread consensus that Congress needs to act. And the question is, will we get bipartisan agreement? If this is a shirts and skins divide, if this is Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other, it's never going to get passed. And so I am trying to find Democrats who are willing to work together to find common ground, because that's what it's going to need to get this done. A year ago, I was very optimistic that we would get this done this year. I have to admit, my optimism level for legislation moving this year has dropped substantially. But the good news is we've got an election coming up in November. I think it is exceedingly likely that Republicans are going to take the majority of the Senate. And if that happens, I am in line to be the next chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. The Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over about 40% of the U.S. economy, including athletics. And so if I am the next chairman starting in January, this is going to be a major, major priority for the Commerce Committee, and I hope we get it done by the end of next year.
And look, people hear you talking about bipartisan support, and some may roll their eyes, but I mean, that is clearly in place with what is going on with your demands to the World Anti-Doping Agency right now, that they provide a little bit more transparency with regards to positive tests for PEDs, but still allowing athletes who have tested positive to compete in the Olympics, like what happened in Tokyo a few years ago. And you're trying to do so ahead of the Paris Games here that start next month. And with bipartisan support, it's not just you, but also a Democrat from Washington, Maria Cantwell, who are demanding this out of WADA. Have you heard anything from WADA right now? And what else do people need to know about this?
That is exactly right, that we have seen bipartisan cooperation in this area previously, and I hope we will see more of it. Maria Cantwell is currently the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee. I'm currently the ranking member, which means the senior Republican on the Senate Commerce Committee, and she and I together opened an investigation into the World Anti-Dumping Agency regarding a report that the agency allowed Chinese swimmers who tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs to compete at the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. And obviously, Team USA is set to compete against many of the same swimmers in Paris, and we're demanding that WADA provide documents regarding the 2021 doping case, and we're calling for real action to guarantee fair competition for Team USA during both the Paris Olympics and the Paralympic Games. You look back to April. In April, the New York Times detailed how 23 Chinese swimmers tested positive for banned substances prior to 2021 Tokyo Olympic Games. And WADA declined to make that public or to challenge the Chinese anti-doping agency's assertion that the swimmers accidentally ingested the banned drugs during a hotel stay. And those swimmers went on to win several medals, including 3 golds, beating American swimmer Katie Ledecky. And so WADA's decision simply to accept the Chinese findings is in stark contrast to its decision to challenge an initial exoneration by the Russian anti-doping agency of a figure skater who tested positive for a banned substance because of, quote, food environmental contamination. That was less than 6 months later. And so the Russian figure skater was disqualified from the 2022 Olympic Winter Games, and yet a different standard was applied to the Chinese swimmers. And so my hope is that together, putting in place bipartisan oversight and pressure, we're going to be able to protect the American swimmers and ensure that they can compete on a fair playing field.
Do you expect WADA to ultimately comply?
I hope so. I think they should. And I think one of the important pieces to pressing them to comply is public scrutiny. And so joining together, the Senate Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over their activities, and Maria Cantwell, in this regard, she and I are on exactly the same page, and we want to see fair and uniform standards that are transparent and applied to everyone.
He is. U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, nice enough to join me for a few minutes to talk NIL, Olympics, and more. Senator Cruz, thank you so much for the time today. We'd love to catch up again in the next month or two. I know we barely scratched the surface here. There is NIL happening at the high school level now. Texas and A&M are resuming their rivalry in football this year. It's exciting times in the world of sports, and thank you to all the efforts that you make to try and make sure that things are as fair and as, I guess, healthy to continue forward as possible.
Well, thank you, Trey. I appreciate it. I got to say, I'm thrilled that the Longhorns and Aggies are finally playing each other. I can tell you for a decade, every time I met with UT or A&M, I would lean on them and say, look, I don't care what else you do, but you two need to play each other. It's not right. Texas deserves this. Now, the next thing I want to see is I want to see it back on Thanksgiving. That's when it belongs, is on Thanksgiving Day. But I'll take the fact that they're playing each other as a big step forward. It's a big step for the whole state to be able to root and enjoy it.
Completely agreed. Who are you rooting for in that game?
I got to say, I'm elected statewide, so on that game, I am Switzerland. I love them both, and I'm not a complete fool, so I will be utterly and completely neutral on that game.
That's good for you, too, because nobody can blame you if you're actually at the game and one team wins and the other doesn't, like people love to do.
Exactly true, but I will say it is one of the great joys of representing Texas. I get to go to a lot of games, and my rule is I'll cheer on any Texas team against any non-Texas team. And we've had some amazing teams, both college and pros, and so there's a lot to cheer on, and it really is a ton of fun, including the last 7 years, the amazing run by the Astros, and I'm a lifelong Astros fan, so that's been particularly spectacular.
I'm a Rangers fan, so I'm going to bite my tongue right now, but thank you so much for the conversation.
Congrats. You guys had a big win, and you know what? You deserve to beat the Stros this time around. That pained me to say it, but y'all outplayed us and beat us.
Yeah, it was an incredible series and a magical run. We now know what it feels like, just like y'all have gotten a couple of times now. So there you go. Thank you so much, Ted.
Take care. Bye-bye.